We're talking about the axial skeleton and the 80 bones. Those bones are then segregated into three regions. You can see from this figure, 7.1, we have the skull up top. We have the vertebral column that runs down the middle, and then you have what's called the bony thorax making up the rib cage. So we'll start at the skull. This is the body's most complex bony structure. It's formed by the cranium, over the top here, and then the facial bones. The cranium, of course, protects the brain. It's the side of, and then the side of it for the muscle attachments back here for your neck and your head, so you can move your head around. And then your facial bones, this provides the framework for your face. And then it also houses like your sense organs, your eye, your nose, mouth, and your teeth. Provides openings for air and food. We've got all that. And then, of course, anchors any facial muscles for expressions. Now, out of the 8 cranial bones, a couple of them are paired. Let's see, the paired ones are the parietals, which are up top here. So here's my skeleton. This is, I got Franklin. And so Franklin's parietal bones are up here. We got 2 of them. Right below the parietal bones, we have the temporal bones on the sides, and you guys know where your temples are at here, so that's the temporal bone. Those are paired, and then the singles are the frontal bone right up front here, the occipital in the back, and then the sphenoid. You can't really see the sphenoid on this picture. It's deep, but it comes into play here on the side, and then it goes across the whole skull, and so it's got some cool parts to it in there. So that's the sphenoid, and then the other one is not what's marked on my yellow here, but in the picture it's better here, this orange part. That is the ethmoid bone. And so it's hard to see that on Franklin, but it's nice that we have that option to take a look at. Your cranial bones are really thin, but yet they're really strong for their weight. So let's start with the frontal bone. The frontal bone, of course, is the anterior portion of your cranium right up top here. This articulates with the parietal bones up on the very top, and they articulate at what's called the coronal or the frontal suture. And so you do have some major markings. The only ones I hold you to on this are the supraorbital foramen, and that's the holes above the eyes that you can see on Franklin, or that's better on the picture right here. There's your supraorbital foramen. And then I think it's important that you know that you've got frontal sinuses. Your frontal sinuses are up here. Remember, sinuses are those openings. Ooh, I can show you this on Franklin. Let's take the skull off. It's hard to see, but this gets thicker here, but you actually have more of a spongy network here of bone in this frontal bone. And so that's how you can, that's the sinus. So sinuses are those openings, and you've got those. It's very clear on some bones. Okay, those are the only couple things I want you to know about the frontal bone. The next are the parietal bones. When it comes to the parietal bones, these are the ones that make up this superior portion of your brain, and then it also makes up most of the lateral here on the sides. Remember, superior is up top, lateral is going out away from the midline. There are some things you need to know. Of course, the coronal suture that we just had. This is the squamous suture going down, and I don't hold you to a lot of sutures, but I think these 4 are important. So coronal, squamous, lambdoid or lambdoidal, and the sagittal suture, which is the one going right down the middle. Remember, sagittal, mid-sagittal puts that line down the middle, so we have a right and left. The sagittal suture is going to divide between your right and your left parietal bones, and I think you should know that. Okay. Back here, we're on the occipital bone. The occipital bone, this is the posterior wall of your cranium. And the important parts on this, I'm going to find another picture here to show you. There we go. I like this because the 2 things I want you to get out of the occipital is the foramen magnum. Foramen means hole, right? And magnum means it's the large hole. That's the big one. So that's where your spinal cord's going to come out of. And then here, your occipital condyles. We had the word condyle. We know that that's where bones articulate. So this is where your skull actually sits on top of the vertebrae. And that's the purpose of the occipital condyles. Okay, back to the temporal bones. So here's the temporal bone, and this is a real version of it. This forms what would be considered the inferiolateral aspect of the skull. It's divided into 4 regions, but I'm not going to hold you to the regions, but there are some markings that I think are important. The zygomatic process is one of those. That's that part that sticks out from your temporal bone. I think that's really important. You've got these 2 processes down here. You've got the mastoid process. You can feel your mastoid process right behind your ear. It's that lump behind your ear. And I can show that to you on Franklin. There is his mastoid process. Notice the little red mark here. That's because it was used on a test. So that one's kind of important. Underneath there, you've got the styloid process. That one's real sharp. Hard to see on Franklin because it's too small, but you can see it sticking down here. There's the styloid process. That one's important. The external acoustic or external auditory meatus. Remember, a meatus is a hole going in. So that's your ear canal going in, external acoustic meatus. And then finally, you have the mandibular fossa. Remember, this is your mandible, your jaw is your mandible, and this fossa is where your mandible hooks in. So those are the parts of the temporal bone I think are really important, and I think that you should know those. Okay. Here's the sphenoid bone. This is the one I couldn't really show you because it's so deep. I can show you parts of it on Franklin, like this part right here in the middle. This is what's called the sella turcica, and that stands for Turkish saddle. But anyway, it's easier to look at pictures on this one, so I'm going to put Franklin down and let you just look at pictures here. When it comes to the sphenoid bone, just know that it's this large area that's behind the nasal, and actually it has a lot of sinuses that run through it. You do have a sphenoid sinus, and that's important. Obviously, the greater wings are important, and really the 2 parts I'd like you to know, if you know that it has the greater wings, and then the sella turcica, and I still haven't found that link. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here is the sella turcica right there. So that's what it looks like. That's plenty for the sphenoid bone. My last bone is the ethmoid bone, and this one lies deep to most of the skull bones, but it lies between the sphenoid bone and the nasal bones. Nasal bones are out here just inside your eyes. I'll show you those here in a second. The cool part about this, okay, obviously we have the perpendicular plate. That's what's going to come down in the nose, and you can actually see that sticking down in the nose, and so that's down here. But I don't think that's the cool part. I think the cool part is called the cribriform plate. Okay, so the cribriform plate is right here, and it's got all these holes in it because your olfactory receptors go straight through this bone. Once again, you do have a sinus inside here, the ethmoid sinuses, and they're showing the pictures of this thing opened up. So that's the ethmoid bone. Okay, let's move to the facial bones. There are 14 bones that make up your face, and only the mandible, your jaw, and the vomer, which is in your nose, it's the bottom one going up, I'll show you in a minute. Those are the 2 singles. Everything else is paired. It's weird to think that your maxilla bone up here is a paired bone, but it is. Your zygomatics, remember we had the zygomatic process come around. You have nasal bones, lacrimal bone, I'll show you. Anyway, so first one we got here is mandible. There's parts of the mandible that I think that are important. First of all, the mandibular condyle. We said the other day that one of the videos that condyles are where bones come together. So the mandibular condyle is where your jaw actually locks into your temporal bone. Next to it, you have the mandibular notch. It just kind of sticks up, so it's kind of cool. And then the coronoid fossa coming up. The ramus of the mandible is this bar-like structure coming down. And then we come around the mental foramen, or the holes in the chin. I looked up mental thinking, what's the Greek, what's the Latin here? Mental means chin, useful. Anyway, so we have the alveolar margins, that's where your teeth lock in. And so that's kind of important. There is a mandibular foramen on the inside, but I don't think even Franklin, oh, you can see it in Franklin, he's got one in there. We can look at that. So anyway, those are the markings of the mandible that I think are important. So moving to the maxillary bone, this medially fuses in the middle. So your upper jaw comes in and fuses. So it's actually 2 bones that make up the portion of your upper jaw. The major markings here are the palatine, which is the roof of your mouth up here. This is the palatine, okay? Of course, we have, you can see coming off here, this is the zygomatic process that was part of the temporal bone. We also have it part of the maxilla here. Of course, alveolar margins where your teeth all go in. And then you do have sinuses in here that are important. So your maxillary sinuses. So again, if you go in for a sinus infection, your doctor's tapping on each side of your nose in this area. He's just tapping for a sinus infection or to see if you have inflammation in those sinuses. Other bones of the face are going to include the nasal bones. And so here's my nasal bones up top here. See it? And then next to the nasal bones, we have the lacrimal bones. Where'd my pointer go? There's my pointer. There's the lacrimal bone right there. And then palatine bones, part of the palatine, it's all up underneath the roof of your mouth. So nasal, of course, forms the bridge of your nose. Lacrimal creates the medial walls of the orbit on your eyes. And then they also hold the lacrimal sac, which we'll see in later chapters. And then the palatine bones form part of the hard palate, which is the roof of your mouth. The bone that I think is cool is called the vomer. Here's the vomer right here in the nose, and it goes up. The word vomer, I looked up, the Latin or the Greek, it means plowshare. It looks like a plow. And if you ever look at a vomer by itself, it really does have the shape of a plow. So but it makes up the nasal septum. And then you can see you've got other parts, other bones in here, but like the inferior nasal conch. These are paired curved bones in the nasal cavity, and they just make up part of the lateral walls of your nasal cavity, and you can see inside there. Okay, this ends the skull. I think I'm going to stop this video here.